I wanted to bring today's episode to the podcast talking all about adrenal deficiency. This is a theme that we see with couples that have low AMH, high FSH, diminished ovarian reserve, and premature ovarian insufficiency. That sometimes we myopically will focus in on that egg health, and the adrenals can be a reason why the egg health is off. And so if you're dealing with acne, if you have PMS, if you've got anxiety or panic attacks, maybe you're feeling like really dependent on caffeine, maybe you're losing hair, maybe you have got low energy and way more, this episode is for you. It is key to address the adrenals, and it's not about running straight to donor eggs, which typically we will get with those diagnoses will be recommended donor eggs, and no one has dug deeper to look at the health of the adrenals. Excited for you to listen to today's episode. Let's go. Hey, Katie, excited to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Today, we're going to be talking all about the adrenals. This is something for me where when I just literally I was looking at a podcast we just released actually this week. I'm recording this on, what is today? Oh, February the 15th, that we just released, and talking about I was always so impatient and I'm like racing around. I had to like race and do everything. And now I do things one step at a time. And I'm like, I read that today because I said that like a month or so ago. And I'm like, no, I'm literally today feeling overwhelmed with a list of stuff that in the end of the day doesn't matter. Right. But, and so because for me, it comes that my hair starts falling out, and so it affects my thyroid, like the adrenal and the chronic stress and all of that really matters for our hormones and our fertility. And so if you're like finding yourself pushing yourself, doing this extra thing, how do you still get things done? Like one thing every day is a success, rather than this mounting to-do list and then feeling basically overwhelmed and burnt out, really.
Yeah. And I think burnout, sadly, is a term that all too many of us are familiar with now. It's so much of it is in the nature of the modern world, and because there are a huge amount of stresses and strains, and we think that we're invincible, and we think that we can and should be doing it all, and the reality is we can't, and we shouldn't. We do need to try and step back a little bit. And the mind-body connection, Sarah, I think is a really interesting one, because again, in terms of, I come from originally, a nursing background, and so much of that is just like, well, the body is the body and the mind is the mind, and never the two shall meet. And it's like, no, they are one and the same. That your mind is in your body, and and dictates so much of what happens in your body. You can't separate the two, and the adrenal glands and the adrenal hormones are the perfect example of that. So I think it's a really, really important topic to delve into.
Absolutely. And so we're supporting couples, with low AMH or high FSH, premature ovarian insufficiency, or diminished ovarian reserve. And this is something that we see regularly when we run some of our testing. We'll talk about that a little bit later, that we see that like adrenals are like flatlined. So let's talk about, well, first of all, what are the adrenals?
Yes. So the good starting point. So the adrenals they're part of the endocrine system. And so the endocrine system is essentially referring to our hormones. And our hormones are, they're like a big old web. They're a big old network within our body. And the adrenal hormones are produced primarily by the adrenal glands. So it's normally glands in our body that produce hormones. And the adrenals sit on top of the kidneys. So they're not a part of the kidney function as such. But yeah, they're like little kidney baseball caps. And they regulate and produce lots of critical hormones in the body, but their primary functions are around the production of stress hormones, and the main stress hormone is cortisol. But also things like adrenaline. So that comes from the word adrenal, right? Adrenaline. So it's adrenaline is also, or epinephrine, which is another word for it, is produced in the adrenal glands too. So very much responsible for this. or very much integral to our fight or flight response. And I think most people by now have heard of fight or flight, but if you haven't, then it's really thinking about fight or flight is an adaptive response that any animal has when it's in danger. So when there is any kind of real or perceived threat, fight or flight refers to kind of that animal's instinctive response of how they're going to deal with that danger. And there's a split second decision for the body, like, am I going to fight, or am I going to flight? Am I going to run? And so that is very much a physiological response in the body, because your body, regardless of what the threat or the perceived threat actually is, in the animal kingdom, the threats can be really real, but nowadays the threats aren't really real, but we still have the same physiological responses, and so our bodies are then primed to either fight or to run. And so the blood rushes to the parts of our body that will prime us to be able to either fight or to run quickly, to either attack or to flee from that perceived threat. Now the reality is, we live in a world now where thankfully, there are very, very few circumstances in life where there is an actual, a real threat to our life. But our bodies still have the same response. So that could be, okay, well, we're running late for a meeting and we're caught in a traffic jam. Our bodies are still going to have the fight or flight response. There's no real danger to our lives there. But as soon as we feel that, we're all familiar with that high stress feeling. Some of us all too much familiar. And it's that response that we're talking about with fight or flight.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So some of us go for years and years in that stuck in that fight or flight. And it's like, I've been fine for the last little while. And now I'm like, oh, why is this like feeling that overwhelm, and like that I've got this like monstrous list of things to do, which, and I haven't done meditation in a while. So now I'm like back on the meditation piece. So that kind of keeps me, because it was getting to a point actually where I would be like, I'd be doing something really fun and be like, ooh, what's next? And then I'd be like eating my dinner. Ooh, okay, after I'm gonna do that. And so I was like, always like over here, all the things I was doing next, instead of like, let's just be here. And even though it's fun, whatever maybe the fun thing I was doing next, it's like, let's, be present in mindfulness, and we'll talk a little bit about the strategies later on. But let's talk about, okay, so adrenal fatigue versus that, HPA dysfunction. So adrenal fatigue kind of being an older way of looking at this. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, exactly. And adrenal fatigue is a term that I learned when I was in nutrition school, and it's one that was, I guess, it's testament to the fact that science moves forward, right? And so the perception previously was our adrenals would like physically get fatigued, right? And so and no longer be able to function properly. The thing that we've learned more and more about within the context of the endocrine system, which is the hormone systems in the body, is how much they interconnect. And ultimately, all of our hormones are governed by the brain, and are very, very much connected to the brain. And there's two glands within the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands, that are largely responsible for talking to the other respective organs in the body that then produce their respective hormones. So we can't consider the adrenal hormones outside of the context of the brain. So we talk about the HPA axis, and so that refers to the hypothalamic, the pituitary, and the adrenal axis, the HPA axis. And so that refers to the way in which all of those hormones and glands talk to each other, because they work on feedback loops. So when for example, when cortisol gets too high in our system, it will be the brain that will pick up on that and say, hey, we need to calm this down, or we need to pick it up again. again if that's needed. And so we talk about HPA axis, and actually what I always recommend talking about is I don't talk about the HPA axis alone. I talk about the HPOAT axis, and that is a bit of a mouthful, but ultimately so if we think about this in terms of a triangle, an upside down a pyramid shape, is we've got our hypothalamus and our pituitary glands in the brain, and they're like the control centers for everything. And then we have our thyroid, which sits in the neck, the thyroid gland. And then we have the ovaries in the case of female hormones, and we have the adrenals. Okay. And they are all interconnected, and we're going to talk a little bit more in this episode about that connection with the thyroid and why it's so important in the context of fertility, because you might be listening to us talk so far and think, well, okay, cool, but what's that got to do with me when I'm struggling to have a baby? And the truth, it has everything to do with it, and it's because of this axis, the HPOAT axis, and the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland work in conjunction with that triangle, the thyroid, the ovaries, and the adrenals, and you cannot. One will up or down regulate the other. You can't separate those three systems from one another. They are intricately connected, and they all do a dance and respond to one another. You know, hormones are literally just chemical messengers. And so these chemical messages are sent throughout our bloodstream, and our body and our brain responds to that, as do the other hormone systems. So really, really important to remember that these stress hormones, the adrenal hormones, I know you might be sick and tired of, you know, the amount of people that have said, oh, calm down and you'll get pregnant, relax and you'll get pregnant. And that is infuriating to hear. I know, I've been there. But you know, there is something in it, and might not be that simple of like, oh, well, you know, have a bath and then you'll get pregnant. It is, you know, it's got to be a longer term strategy, but absolutely when we're trying to conceive, the adrenal side of things, of that HPOAT axis, has to be of integral importance.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about some of the signs of adrenal dysfunction, like that tired, wired, and anxious. That's an interesting one. Like you're exhausted, but you're like feeling jittery, and that the whole anxiety piece too, where a lot of the times in conventional medicine, we're just been given a pill for anxiety, and maybe it's your adrenals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is a really good time to talk about the other function of cortisol, which is that primary adrenal hormone that I spoke about, that's involved in this kind of stress, fight or flight response. The other main function for cortisol is its involvement in our circadian rhythm. So our circadian rhythm refers to our waking and sleep cycles and our connection with day and night. And the reason cortisol is very much involved in that is because in a normally functioning and happy adrenal and a happy HPA axis, we will wake up in the morning. And again, there are exceptions to this. If you're a shift worker, you might be thinking, hey, I don't wake up in the morning, I wake up in the evening. And you know, that does add some extra layers of complexity. But talking about a diurnal person who kind of wakes in the morning, in an ideal world, then our adrenals we will have a rush of cortisol within that 2 hours of rising. So a typical day should look on a graph as though you wake up, your cortisol is low when you wake up, and then you have a rise, a spike, and then it drops back down. And at the end of the day, that's gone down to more or less nothing. And that, you know, that cortisol is not always problematic. Cortisol is there for a reason, and that spike in the morning is what helps us to give us our get up and go for the day, right? It gives us that drive. It helps us to wake us up and not feel too sleepy. Now, what can happen for some people in terms of, especially what you say there, Sarah, this tired but wired kind of symptom presentation, is lots of people, and you may well resonate with this as listeners because so many people do, is like getting a second wind in the evening. So having like being shattered, like having a real slump in like the middle of the afternoon or the early evening, like, you know, lots and lots of people at sort of, you know, 8 p.m. they're like, I could go to bed right now, I'm so tired. And then by 10 p.m. they suddenly find that they're wide awake. And then, you know, bedtime gets pushed back and pushed back. And then they're going to bed at midnight, 1 a.m. And they just like really struggle to get to sleep. And that is because of this, when cortisol is imbalanced. So when we are having this constant stress response, or we're anxious, etc., that cortisol rhythm in our circadian rhythm, it gets a bit messed up. And so we don't have the same rise that we should do in the morning. And perhaps we don't get the same slump as I don't want to use the word slump, but because it should be a slump in the evening of cortisol. And so that can then mean that we're wide awake by the time it comes to going to bed. And cortisol works in tandem, in conjunction with melatonin, which is the sleep hormone. So when we're thinking about cortisol in the context of this circadian rhythm and day-night cycles, we want the cortisol to be higher in the morning, reduce, and then what happens in the evening in an ideal world is that then melatonin starts to rise. And of course, melatonin is the sleepy hormone. Melatonin is what helps us have a really sound, restorative night's sleep. And melatonin and sleep are, of course, incredibly important to health. I'm sure you've probably done episodes on sleep before, Sarah. But really importantly, melatonin is also a very, very powerful antioxidant for our eggs. So melatonin is not just related to sleep. It's also a really significant part of our egg health. So you can start to see already, just from this very kind of surface level description, how our brains and our bodies are very intricately connected. And you can start to see how some of these things then knock on to our ovarian health and to our fertility.
And we see a lot of people that are like supplementing with melatonin, which, you know, it can be part of a solution, but then, well, why is it low in the first place? Sometimes there can be gut bugs, or, you know, in this case, is there, you know, the blue and green light can then impact, so many things can impact your melatonin. So supplementing can be good, but that's not part of the whole solution. That's just a Band-Aid.
Yes, exactly. You know, sometimes, you know, supplements can be really helpful and really powerful, but we always want to think about the why. You know, we don't just want to stick it, as you say, stick a Band-Aid on it and hope for the best. Like, why is that melatonin off in the first place? And also, are you sure that it is off? Like, you know, just because you are struggling with sleep doesn't necessarily mean that you've got an issue with melatonin. There are all sorts of things. You know, estrogen can disrupt sleep. You know, blood sugars can disrupt sleep. There's, as you say, gut bugs can disrupt sleep. So there's all sorts of reasons why that might happen. So if you're struggling with your sleep and then you've just thrown melatonin at it, it's not necessarily the solution.
Yeah, and a lot of the fertility blogs and books will tell you, you know, pound down melatonin. There's studies that it's helped with IVF, but really, again, it's not looking at the whole picture. So some signs of adrenal dysfunction. So even premature ovarian insufficiency, premature menopause, low libido, poor egg health. Like, we're like focusing in on the egg health, doing superfoods and taking a bunch of supplements. Well, maybe the adrenals need support. And then why are the adrenals off? Difficulty with sleep, those worsening PMS symptoms. There can be depression, acne, a lot of that anxiety or panic attacks, weight gain, intolerance to cold, which that can sometimes be confused, I guess, with thyroid issues, because that can be, you know, hair loss. Yeah, I've experienced that. High blood pressure, low blood pressure. Yeah, I'll have Katie take some of these because there's not number on the list here, but it can be confused with a number of other different things where we then use a Band-Aid approach to then attack, you know, what the symptom is and not getting to the underlying healing opportunity of why it's like that in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, lots of these symptoms are symptoms that could be linked to all sorts of different things, but as you say, it's this like high or low blood pressure, remembering the adrenal glands do sit on the kidneys, and when we are in that fight or flight response, it impacts our blood pressure very quickly, and so that can have an impact, and then the energy, being as we said, this really tired, really low on energy, but then also potentially wired or unable to sleep. But then the anxiety piece as well, and like irritability, and also like it can impact the immune system. Like if we're constantly, we all know when we're feeling a bit depleted, don't we? And we all know that when we feel depleted, it kind of welcomes infections in. And so how many times have you been feeling run down, and then suddenly you get infection after infection, and it's because your immune system is just letting it in, because it's not, your defenses are just not as they should be. Because ultimately the reason for this is when our body, you have to remember that our body's primary mechanism above anything else is survival. And if we are in fight or flight, a lot of the time the body is in survival mode. It is literally primed as though there is an immediate threat to life. And when there is an immediate threat to life, your body simply cannot prioritize things like the keeping the immune system in tip-top condition, keeping the reproductive system, and in some ways it can even start to shut the reproductive system down, because your body is saying, hey, it's not safe to be reproducing right now, and so it's and digestion as well. It's not going to be, we always think of the opposite of flight and fight being rest and digest. And so if we are in this constant state of heightened state of overactive adrenals and overactive cortisol production, then it's going to impact things like our nutrient absorption potentially, and mean that we're depleted in nutrients, which can in turn then have knock-on effects for other systems in the body. So it's essentially, the best way to understand it is like, okay, my body is literally in survival mode, and if my body is in survival mode, there are so many things, so many kind of other services that are tuned down as a result of that.
Okay, so, and I look at this list and I'm like, damn, I feel like, so I diagnosed with POI, premature ovarian insufficiency, at 28. And I feel like I can check the box on a number of those things, like the low blood pressure. I mean, like walking up the stairs going, damn, I'm going to pass out. The hair loss, the cold. Like I hold my husband's hand. His hand's practically sweating. Mine is like a piece of ice. Obviously I had thyroid issues too, but it's like we want to rush to the fertility clinic. We've got this premature ovarian failure, insufficiency, low AMH, high FSH. And then no one has looked at this piece. And then we pump ourselves full of hormones, where there's things we can do to work on our health, and I think, in this sort of panic and impatience piece. And then that just makes the adrenals worse. Like I was just dealing with something with my son right now. And I'm like trying to get him to do something, which that never works. But I felt like I was about to have some sort of stress meltdown. But it's interesting, and the irritability, like for years that would really show up for me, because I'd be like, I'm just going to do more things, I'm going to keep going, I'm going to go, and I wasn't able to step back and relax, because I thought that would be like seen as failure. Like I'm like, I can't, I got to keep going, and I did, until the body said, I don't think so. Not going to work.
It's like a typical high achiever thing, isn't it? You just like think you should be doing all the things. And, I think in a lot of ways, this is the plight of the modern woman, because there are just expectations on us from every which direction. And, it's very difficult to keep up with them all at the end of the day. And, so many people that I speak to, and I know this is the case for you as well, Sarah, they're so used to being stressed that they don't even know they're stressed. They think they're not stressed, and it's like, I can see that you're stressed. I recognize this. I've seen it enough to know it, and I've seen it in myself enough to know it. But we become so hardened to it. And it's this attitude of like, well, I just have to carry on. I have to carry on. And sometimes I just have to reflect back to people, you're dealing with a lot here. Like, look at your work commitments. You're not sleeping. You've got these relationship strains. You've got, stuff going on with your parents and wider family. Like, come on, like we need to start giving yourself a break, and sometimes when it is reflected back, people say, oh, okay, I guess like from an outside perspective, my life is a bit hectic.
Yeah, because sometimes we just think we just got to keep going and there's no alternative. But having a guide and having someone, call you out on your own stuff, and you're like, oh wait, and then you don't like it's courageous to ask for help. It's brave to say, damn, this thing is whatever I'm doing right now ain't working. So that sometimes we can't spot it, and we just sort of just push through, muscle on. So let's talk about our not muscle on, whatever that is, push through. Okay, so let's talk about so there are different underlying healing opportunities and reasons for adrenal dysfunction. So those are some of the symptoms you could have. So let's kind of talk about, Katie, so some of these things we're seeing here, starting with the autoimmune conditions. What are we seeing there?
Yeah, I think just to caveat this list first, to just let your listeners know that ultimately, when we're thinking about stress on the body, that can come in all sorts of different ways. And the mental and emotional stress that we've spoken about is a big part of that. But as you can imagine, like there are so many ways that the body might be under stress. And so autoimmunity is one of them. Autoimmunity is when the immune system is not recognizing self. And so it starts to attack its own tissue. And as you can imagine, if your body is started to attack its own tissue, thinking that it's a danger and a threat and a foreign invader, then that is a stress on the body. Okay, so other stresses on the body include infections. So any strain on the immune system, whether that's autoimmune or whether it's bacterial or viral infections. And by the way, these don't need to necessarily, it doesn't need to be that you've got like long COVID or something like that. It can be like hidden infections. Yeah. So sometimes it might be that someone has got like we've spoken before about vaginal health, haven't we? So lots of people have these hidden vaginal infections that they didn't even know about, and that's a strain on the immune system, right? And so that's a stress on the body that can then impact the HPA axis, and other other things like viruses that can lay dormant in our system for quite some time. Things such as Lyme and all sorts of things that can be hiding in our systems. It's not necessarily a situation where it's like, oh yeah, I get infections all the time, although it can be that too. And then accidents and injuries, right? So again, that causes an inflammatory response in the body, and that then takes its toll on this HPA axis. Interestingly, excessive exercise. So again, like feeding into this, maybe type A personality, got to do it all, got to get everything done. And hey, guess how I bust my stress? I run it out at the gym every evening for an hour. It's or I'm training for a marathon, or whatever that might be, or I go crazy at spin class. Yes, it's important to move your body, but if you're moving your body in a really high intense or high endurance fashion, whilst you have all of these other big stresses in your life, again, I'm sorry to say it because I know it feels good, but it might not be the best thing for you, and it might be worth considering another way to move your body that is not just quite so intense.
And just also on that one, just hot yoga too, where people are like, I literally in my community, I'm like, I just want to do regular yoga. Every studio is only hot yoga, and that hot yoga is at 103 degrees. Like you go in there and you just drip, and at the end of it, like I did it for a little bit and I'm like, I did it for like a week and actually no, like it just completely destroyed me because my adrenals are kind of in a, they're hanging on. And then that just depleted me. And yeah, I actually got sick. And so people go to hot yoga every day, yeah, sweating it all out. And so, as your coaches and things like that, if we say to you, I want you to, pause the HIIT workouts. I want you to, that excessive cardio or the hot yoga that you just drip and you feel so great afterwards, maybe, a rise of energy, but then is that serving you on the fertility journey? If you kind of want to argue with us, then, we want you to have an open mind. And so sometimes we can't quite see what's happening until someone calls you out on it. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good example, Sarah. I tried hot yoga for a period and it made me feel really rubbish. Like it genuinely, I didn't, it was not for me. And it's, it's super duper intense. Like, why do we need to do yoga under like really intense conditions? It kind of, yeah.
It's crazy. And then, food intolerances, which I think, we've talked a lot about food intolerances on here. So, we have people do the elimination diet, so taking out those top allergens. But we regularly, like, there isn't one couple that's come in where we're like, wow, you're not intolerant to anything. Everything's perfect. No. And it's not to say you're going to take these foods out forever as you heal the gut. You can bring most of them back in. But yeah, food intolerances for sure. And then issues going on in the gut, like we talked about, we do stool tests and then, looking at the DNA of the stool, we see infections, bacterial infections, H. pylori. So that lowers your stomach acid. So you can eat those great foods, but you're not absorbing them. So a lot of the microbiome issues. Anything on that, Katie?
Yeah, it's exactly what I said at the start of this list. It's basically any stressor that you could think of for your body, whether that's illness, injury, infection, your microbiome, which is a really important way of how our body functions. Any kind of toxic burden. So some people are exposed to a high level of occupational like hazards and toxins, for example. Some people might be like lots of people like I don't know, like I'm going to use the example of pilots, for example, that they're exposed to lots of radiation as part of their day-to-day job. People who live in the city like I do, like London, it's one of the polluted cities in the world, and these all our toxic load, our exposure to toxins, and even products that we're using around the house, things we're using on our skin, the plastics that we're drinking from or that we're eating our food out of, these are all things that can contribute to being a stressor on the body, and then that in turn can have a knock-on effect for this HPA axis.
And it is to take, you can go crazy on some of these things and throw all your things out and plastics. And, although you do want to move towards that, it's like each thing, as each product expires, you get a non-toxic one. So you don't go through in a big panic. But we just basically, a lot of the times with the low AMH and high FSH diagnosis, you'll be told that donor eggs are your only option. Well, no one has looked at these stressors, the food, the gut, the environmental toxins, the emotional stress. There's things you can do, which is empowering. And you take it, and then you can you can fast track your success. So a lot of the people we work with, 99%, even I would say like 100% of people we work with, the thyroid has been missed. They've been told the TSH is normal. We've done many podcast episodes on this, so you can check those out. But basically, no one's looking at the full thyroid panel, including antibodies. So let's just talk about the connection between the adrenals and the thyroid just briefly.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've largely explained it in terms of this when I spoke before about the HPOAT axis, and so that triangular field of hormones that connects to the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands in the brain. So they're all regulated by the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and within that triangle is the thyroid, the ovaries, and the adrenals. And in the case of men, it is the same, but it's their gonads. So it's the testes essentially, not the ovaries. So in terms of the way in which that can impact things is just to say, it's, I'm sounding like a broken record here, but it's to hopefully hit the message home that the stress response, the fight or flight response, will always take priority, because fight or flight is anticipating that there is a threat to life. And number one mechanism for your body, number one thing that your body wants to do is survive. And so if that survival mechanisms are flooding into your system through the cortisol, through the adrenaline and all of these kind of stress hormones, then essentially it has the capacity, especially if it's a constant barrage and we're dealing with this day in, day out, it has the capacity to downregulate the thyroid hormone production. And so it can not only can it impact our TSH, which is the thyroid stimulating hormone that's produced by the brain. It can also impact our thyroid conversion, so our actual active thyroid hormones. So at all stages of our thyroid, because you've got TSH, you've got T4 and T3, with T3 being the active thyroid hormone, that's the one that has the most use. At all stages of that process, having kind of an overabundance of cortisol or an HPA disruption, then it can impact that thyroid across all counts.
Yeah, so we do testing as part of our program too, looking at the adrenals tests. And so the Dutch test, we've done a podcast on Dutch 101, so you can look at that. But the dried urine test, it gives us some really good clues as to what's happening with your adrenals. Sometimes people use saliva. We prefer the Dutch, which was urine. Anything you want to say there?
Yeah, so I mean the Dutch test can be helpful. I think the Dutch test can be helpful for people. Sometimes people just need to get like a really obvious view on what's going on. And the nice thing about the Dutch is it looks at like all of the sex hormones, as well as the their pathways of which they're being metabolized. So we won't go into too much detail about that today, but it does also look at your cortisol and your and your melatonin. So we mentioned melatonin before as well. So it can be helpful to actually get some insight into what's going on there. But equally, blood can be useful to get like a snapshot of what's going on in terms of cortisol production. But I mean, in all honesty, I think like, we know, like, if you're listening to this, you can identify with this if this is you, and kind of can identify. I think the vast majority of us could use some adrenal support of some description, right? And to work on calming the nervous system a bit. So we generally know just from talking to people that is something that's going to need a bit of work. And then really importantly then is how that connects. So I think in terms of serum, in terms of blood testing, the thyroid is like a super critical one that we test in detail, including the antibodies, because we want to know what's going on there, and we know that the two dance together very intimately. So it is an important part of your overall clinical picture to test for sure.
Yeah, testing can be part of it. And then also it's important to look at the health history and look at the whole body, right? So there is Dutch, just an adrenal test only for Dutch, or there's other ones that'll kind of go more with the hormones. We have podcasts on MTHFR. We see it's like a gene variant that over 60% of the population have with methylation. This is like a massive topic, and I want Katie to explain it in 30 seconds. No, so anything you wanted to touch on there that, that's why it's important to take a methylfolate for your prenatal, because if you do have the gene variant, your methylation pathways. But how does that impact your adrenals?
Yeah, so essentially, it's not just MTHFR. It can be across the. So when we're talking about methylation, MTHFR is a part of methylation. Methylation is a cellular process that happens constantly in all cells of our body, and is happening all the time. And it's responsible for things like hormone metabolism and also gene transcription. And gene transcription and hormone metabolism are an integral part of growing growing a healthy baby and having a successful pregnancy. So yeah, it is the MTHFR. It's thinking about methylation as a whole as well, because there's lots of genes that can impact methylation, and they connect in. So within methylation, there's a bunch of different cycles. Folate cycle is at the top of that, which is why the folate piece is so important. But as we move through the different methylation cycles, we eventually come to the neurotransmitter cycle. The neurotransmitter cycle is the one that links in with this stress response, and particularly the adrenaline, the noradrenaline, which is linked into this overall stress response. So there are different genes that can up and down regulate different parts of this cycle. But yeah, ultimately, it's really important to make sure that you're, if you need them, that you're having those methylated vitamins and considering that, because then those adrenaline responses can be up or down regulated depending on what's going on for you genetically.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about, there you go, good job. Let's talk about some diet. So you want to make sure you have a lot of fats and proteins in your diet. Some of those superfoods, which can be good, what are the superfoods? So we have salmon and nuts. Anything else there for the superfoods?
Yeah, I mean, look, superfoods I think are any nutrient dense food I do think of as a superfood. It doesn't have to be like your kind of random like algae or this kind of thing. It's any nutrient dense foods, and really thinking about eating the rainbow is really, really important. And when I say eating the rainbow, I'm talking about plant foods. A diversity of plant foods, not artificial colours.
Skittles.
Yeah, exactly. And then, things like omega-3s, I mean, we've done a whole podcast on omega-3s recently, but, in terms of food source omega-3s, then, thinking about things like your oily fish, super duper important, and just getting enough protein in the diet, super important, just getting the balance right of those macronutrients and not being, really importantly, not being on the blood sugar roller coaster all day long, because that's going to be a massive driver for this cortisol and this stress response.
Yeah, so if you're feeling hangry or you have those sugar cravings or poor sleep, that could be an indicator of blood sugar issues. Also, adding some chamomile tea. I'm on a chamomile tea kick right now. Actually, it's nice. I'm enjoying that at nighttime.
Love chamomile tea.
Yeah. Sleep, prioritizing sleep. Yeah, we've done many podcasts on sleep. The most restorative sleep is between 10 p.m. to 12 p.m. So getting to sleep earlier. We talked about getting that, that second wind where maybe you feel like, starting to vacuum at 9:30, you're doing all your chores, where it's like typical wind down time. But if you got an adrenal dysfunction going on, you could feel, so it is to kind of force yourself into bed, and whatever that may be, having a bath or reading a book, or like having a sleep routine. If you're going to bed at 1, we don't want to say, great, now I want you to go to bed at 10. No, each week you ratchet it back by 15 minutes and, in increments, and do it slowly. Anything you wanted to say there?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are all fundamental things that we need to be focusing on, but even though they're fundamental, they can feel quite overwhelming, and the last thing we want to do is feel overwhelmed about all the things that we're not doing right. Okay, and this is why actually getting support is so important, because when we're talking about making changes to diet and changes to lifestyle, it's not rocket science. We all know what we could and should be doing to be being a bit healthier, but it's actually doing it in the context of your busy life that can be the hard part. And that's where working with someone to actually support you with that is really helpful, because you can then set mini goals for yourself. And, it's as you say, like doing things incrementally. Like we always think about things in terms of a step at a time. Like, okay, here's the ultimate goal, sure, but if we're over here right now, you can't just leap to there. You need to just take the next step and the next step. And as you build momentum, you build your confidence, and you start to feel better, and you start to have these wins. And so, if you're listening to this and thinking, oh, whatever, this is just too much for me to even think about right now. It's not, I promise it's not too much to think about. All you need to think about is like, what can get me a step closer today? Like, what could I do today that's going to take me a step closer to that? And really, that's the best thing to be thinking about. So yeah, thinking about sleep, super duper important. And that of course comes into the whole stress management piece. This ultimately we're talking about stress here, and mental and emotional strains, anxieties, whatever, whatever triggers those thought processes of worry for you. And it's different for everybody. It's worth just trying to take a step back, because reflection can often be like the most important tool. Awareness is always the first piece of the equation. So having a step back, today, maybe you could have a think about, what does trigger thought processes for me that like then send me off on a spiral? Like, what are those things? Because if you think about what they are, then you can start to notice them a bit more. And if you notice them a bit more, noticing automatically detaches you a little bit from that thing, right? And from there, you can start to kind of build more of a separation between those things, and kind of feel calm even in the face of all of the worrying things that might be happening in our life. And then of course you've got there are so many tools that we can use, and there's so many accessible tools out there, from meditation to calm yoga, not hot yoga, to things like just being out in nature, and mindful activities and heart math. We're so spoilt for choice now in terms of things that we can be doing to calm our nervous system.
Yeah, it's to pick one a day, right? Because we can get this self-care list where we're like, oh my goodness, I need to have my Epsom salt bath. I got to have my tea. I got to read the book. I got to put my, I've got to do a whole sleep routine with essential oils. I've got to like, all that can be like, are you kidding me? I just want to like go to bed.
Yeah.
So just pick one thing to actually get into bed. And you don't need to do the laundry at 10 o'clock at night. If you find yourself getting that second wind, turn off the TV. Don't read a cliffhanger like book that's got a cliffhanger show or book, like, because otherwise you'll just go to the next one. So let's just talk about some supplements here that can help us. So definitely magnesium, which is one of our foundational supplements. Vitamin D3, K2 is really good. B12 can be good as well. GABA can be help. You can just have that when you're feeling stressed. And then also there's some adaptogens. So reishi, Katie and I were talking about this beforehand, and she's like, I'm like, yeah, should I do that as a tea? Because I do that, because I'll have that as 4-sigmatic, I think, as a coffee one, what can be good, which tastes fine. But then I had none of the tea, and she's like, yeah, that tastes like dirt. So find one doesn't taste like dirt. You can do a supplement, but yeah, let's talk a little bit about some of the supplements.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you named some really nice ones there, and I think that reishi it's a mushroom, for those that aren't aware, and it comes under a category of herbal products that are called adaptogens. And adaptogens, or plants that have adaptogenic properties, are literally what that means is that they calm the nervous system. They help calm the nervous system. So things like rhodiola and ashwagandha can be useful. I would always recommend taking any herbal product under the guidance of a practitioner, because ashwagandha can have implications for your hormone production. So it can up and down regulate certain hormones. So always tread with caution there, and make sure that it's right for you as an individual. Remember, we are all individual, and what is right for one might not be right for another. But reishi, generally speaking, I do really love, because it can be super nutritive for things like the thyroid as well, and even for like thyroid antibodies. So people who have got an autoimmune picture of the thyroid, and like Hashimoto's, reishi can be a really, really nice product to take as well. And then, as you say, like the magnesium, really important. All of the B vitamins are heavily implicated in that methylation pathway that I spoke about before. And so and that doesn't necessarily mean that more is better. It just means that, it's worth getting them looked at. Like, have a look, see what your B12 is doing.
Absolutely. So, let's do. What are your final thoughts here on our topic today?
Yeah, final thoughts are, stress is an unavoidable part of the modern world. It's something that, we are all exposed to. It's something that is unavoidably linked with our fertility. Like, there is no doubt that the two are connected in so many different ways, some of which we've covered today. And but absolutely, there's things that we can do about it. It can feel really helpless and we can feel like a slave to our lives, but actually, just taking these smaller steps or can really have a profound difference. So please don't feel overwhelmed by this episode. And the support is there if you need it.
Absolutely. And some of these symptoms that we're feeling can be common but not normal. And it's a clue. Like, you don't need to feel this way like I did for years and years and didn't put the connection together. There's things we can do to optimize our fertility. So thanks again, Katie.
Thank you.